Hey guys, a quick disclaimer before we begin. This review might have spoilers, so if you haven't played this game and want to check it out for yourself, then it's probably better you skip the video. Also, this game review is basically going to be comparing this game to the first one. I won't be analyzing every single bit of detail about the game, just the things that stood out to me. With that said, onto the video. You know, the original Deus Ex was a massive success that did very new things for the time and is still mostly relevant. It had a lot of statements and things to say about the future and that of conspiracy. Many people fell in love with how it dealt with the various themes it presented and consider it a masterpiece of a video game. Considering all of this, its sequel had a lot to live up to. So today, we are going to look at its sequel, Deus Ex Invisible War. We will look at what it took from the original Deus Ex, what it gave in return, and see if it lived up to the original Deus Ex. We will first look at its gameplay, then its story, and finally one of the most important thing in a Deus Ex game, soundtracks. So, without any more delay, let's begin. First of all, let's talk about the most obvious thing about this game. It's an original Xbox game ported to the PC, so everything in here is minimized and does not take advantage of the best technology back then. Everything in here from the gameplay to the story is limited by this single fact, but the worst of them are the GUI and the inventory. Compared to the Resident Evil style inventory system in the first game, this game only gives you about 12 slots in the inventory to carry 12 items, so you can only carry way less compared to the original game. This fact is worsened when you realize that there is a bug in the game in which you can't stack some items to their maximum stack limit. So most of the time, I'd have multiple of the same items, wasting my already limited inventory space. Even worse is the GUI. The GUI in this game is just way too big with not much functionality to them. I mean, they are called GUI for a reason, graphical user interface, because they are graphics that help people interact with the game, not just graphics. For example, the mission log screen only displays one quest info per page. Package flaws like this with technically poor implementations like terrible animations, mediocre voice acting, frequent load screens and crashes, etc., you are not going to have the best experience. This is the main problem that people will point out when you mention this game. But for me, there is more. So, let's talk about them starting with the gameplay. The original game featured a lot of stealth, and many people consider stealth as a pinnacle of the Deus Ex franchise now. But in Deus Ex Invisible War, stealth is non-existent. Here's a demonstration of a stealth section in this game.
I think something's going
Time
on.
for business!
Looks like it's gone, whatever it was.
Here I come, Phoebe. I know you're here, so that's how it's gonna be.
So, if you paid attention to the gameplay, I am literally walking around in front of the enemies using the invisible cloak augment. This is how most of the stealth was for me, unless I was intrinsically motivated to make it interesting. Now, yes, the original Deus Ex had a cloak augment, but it was not this broken. It consumed a lot of bioelectricity and you could not cover the whole map by using this clock augment, as the levels were all very big there and enemies were not this broken. Now, you might think this is only a problem if you were to use the clock augmentation. So what if you wanted, say, the neural interface augment, which allows you to hack computers? If you wanted the neural interface augment, then you could not have the clock augment, as that required the same slot as the clock augment. So if you were to choose the neural interface augment, then there is basically almost no stealth. Like I said before, the AIs are even worse here, so you can guarantee that you will be detected every time, unless you are in vents or are directly not in an area where there are too much enemies. That means combat would be your main gameplay. And if you have heard anything about this game before, it's that this game has the infamous universal ammo system. It basically means all your guns use the same ammo reserve. So if you run out of ammo, then you can't use guns anymore. Now, as much as problematic as it sounds, that is not where my problem was. My problem was with the gunplay mechanics. This game does not have anything that makes gunplay fun. You know, stuff like recoil and headshots. The enemies are spongy and straight up unfun. For context, the shotgun in this game takes about 3 shots to take care of very basic enemies. This is one of the worst shotgun in the history of video games. So that in itself tells you a lot about the combat. You see an enemy, aim on them and just hold the fire button until they just fly off like they're on the moon. There is absolutely no skill required. Look, the original Deus Ex was not the best in the gunplay section too, but it at least had body-centered hitboxes. So, in short, if you were looking for a really fun combat in this game, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but this is not that game. The other thing to talk about are the biomods or augments. You know, which are like one of the main elements of the Deus Ex franchise. This time though, there is no depth to them. Basically, how it works is you collect these biomod canisters that you can find around a level, kinda like in the first game. This allows you to equip/upgrade and augment in the 4 main slots, namely the head, torso, arms, and legs. Now, this in itself is not that bad from what it sounds. Sure, simple, but still engaging enough. But that all goes out of the window when you realize you get these on like an excessive amount. So what ended up happening was by the end of the game, I had enough biomods to redo my whole augmentation set 2 times over. For context, in the first game, augmentation canisters, which are the same as biomods, were valuable items. Once you install them, you could not change them. While that might sound restrictive, it was there so the game did not take the fun out of them. But because this game let it loose, the biomods were not at all engaging this time. Okay, maybe the biomods are a bit of a stinker this time, but something like the hubs would be better this time? Well, not really. You see, this game was made for the original Xbox, which did not have much memory space as mentioned before. So everything had to be small and streamlined, including the hubs. So what ended up happening was that the hubs became a sequence of corridors with occasional large halls. So exploration is very limited and there's not much to see around. Not only that, the amount of hubs there are also less, and 2 of them are reused so that it feels even smaller. But all is not bad though, as I did find 1 or 2 of the hubs were engaging, like the archaeology. Well, so far, what I had talked about might paint the gameplay in a negative light, there are some good to it. I like the jumping in this game. Unlike the first game where JC Denton, the main character, could only jump barely off the ground, Alex Denton here jumps like he has jet boots on his feet. In most games when a character jumps, it feels like there is an impulse of a force that shoots you up. But here, the force just acts continuously over a small amount of time, and it feels like you're on the moon. It did feel fun to jump around like a madman. But that might just be me because I'm mostly intrinsically motivated in most games. The other thing that I liked are the type of grenades the game features. Compared to the other games that I have played except for Mankind Divided, this game has some interesting grenade types. The one I adored was the Spider-Bot. The Spider-Bot is a grenade that when thrown becomes a spider drone that can fit through vents and shock enemies. It was very useful for me when things got rough, and they were very adorable except for the times when I was getting shocked by them. But yeah, even this positive is also an intrinsic motivation. I don't really expect other players to also like this aspect of the game. So, at the end of the day, the gameplay here hopes that the players are intrinsically motivated enough to choke through the very lackluster gameplay. And it ends up as well as that sounds. The gameplay for most players ends up being very unengaging and boring, and it would seem like a fluff to break up the story. So, if this game does not have the best gameplay, then surely the story must carry everything else, right? Well, that's exactly what we are going to take a look at next. Deus Ex Invisible War is set in 2072, where the world fell to a collapse after J.C. Denton infiltrated Area 51 in the previous game. You play as Alex Denton, a trainee to Tarsus Academy. The story begins with a cutscene in which Chicago was bombed by a nanite bomb, which destroyed the entire city. The Tarsus Academy there, where Alex Denton was also attending, was forced to evacuate to Seattle. There you are subjected to another terrorist attack, and you end up having to evacuate the building. Once you are in the city free from Tarsus, you are approached by various organizations like the WTO, who are responsible for ensuring the security of the various settlements, or enclaves as they are called, and groups like the Order Church, who are these very anti-modern technology group who take extreme measures to prevent technological advancements. The story then spirals from there on. Now, before we continue, I want to place a spoiler warning here, as everything I'm going to mention here is gonna ruin this game as well as the first one for you. So if you have not played these games on your own, then skip to the time on screen. Okay, since I mentioned the factions, let's start there. If you have played the first game, you know that game has a lot of factions that you can side with. The factions were what made the story fun, and it was very interesting to learn about them for most players in the first game. But here, the factions are as generic as you can get. The WTO is the basic enforcer faction in stories like these, and the Order Church are the exact opposite without much nuance to them. In the first game, if you look at the factions like the Illuminati and the MJ12, they did not outright hate each other just because the other existed. In fact, the MJ12 and the Illuminati had the same intentions, but the MJ12 was competing with the Illuminati in order to gain power. Compared to that, here the Order Church directly stands against the WTO's intention of advancement of humankind and regulating technology specifically. The other thing about them is that all factions here are extremists. In the first game, factions had shades of gray to them. None of them insisted on the destruction of the others, except for like the MJ12. The best case example that I can provide will be Tracer Tong at the end of the game. He insists that he had to take humanity to the Dark Ages by taking down the Aquinas router hub, not because that was his goal all along, but because at that point, that was the only way of preventing other factions following in MJ12's footsteps. A similar case can also be said for the NSF at the first level. The factions did not automatically rely on extreme measures to accomplish their goals. Compared to that, here, you got the Order Church bombing the Tarsus Academy, killing many people, WTO trying to isolate the poor just because they are poor, etc. So what ended up happening was at a certain point, everything that made sense was thrown out. The factions lost their nuances, and each time they called you in for a mission, they appeared like whining children just because they can't have their way. Most people who came here expecting to immerse themselves and see different views on society ended up seeing wet farts that fell flat on the ground. The worst part of this was your alignment with the factions. This whole mess could have been saved if the game decided that once you chose a faction, you can't do missions for the other side. But guess what? You could align yourself with the WTO the whole game and at the end, choose the other side. So, the resulting mixture is a mismatch of events that when analyzed in the sense of Alex's motivation, it does not make sense. Besides that, I personally saw the whole plot twist of WTO and the Order working towards something pretty much from the start and called it outright then and there. Sure, it turns out they are just two fronts for the Illuminati to control society, but what they will do was spoiled for me regardless. Factions aside, let's talk about Alex Denton himself. Now, in the beginning of the game, you only know Alex as Alex D and not Alex Denton. If you play the first game, you can see Alex in a test tube just like that of JC Denton in one of the later stages. So I don't think this was meant to be a big reveal or anything. But there's this whole scene where Alex acts very surprised that he's one of the Denton brothers, and the game seems to imply that this was a big reveal.
You could have told me and the other trainees about the experiments.
Here you are, our biggest secret, walking straight into a deployment of Templars. Surely you've guessed. You're the next generation of the technology MJ-12 used to create JC Denton. You are the third Denton prototype, a clone of JC.
MJ-12? The offshoot of the Illuminati? This is almost unbelievable. They're the ones who started the Grey Death. I was supposed to be part of a plot to take over the world?
If that was the case, that reveal came out like his personality. Which is the other thing that I want to talk about. Alex Denton is not that interesting. His personality is whatever it wants to be. Like at times, he acts like he is very smart and quick-witted, while other times, he acts very dumb and slow to understand simple things.
MJ-12? The offshoot of the Illuminati? This is almost unbelievable.
But most of the time, he's very generic and one of the more forgettable protagonists. He doesn't have any wants or needs throughout the story, unlike JC, who wanted to be a very successful agent from the very beginning. Besides Alex, we have another sibling to the Denton brothers, Billy Adams. She is introduced to us very briefly in the opening cutscenes and in the opening sections, and it's implied that Alex and Billy grew up together. She from the very start takes the extreme approach of going against the WTO and Tarsus and compels Alex to join the Order Church pretty much from the start. Now, Billy Adams would have been the Paul Denton of this game, since she was the character that was introduced as someone who has the same role of the player character. But in this case, Billy absolutely refused to see the side of the WTO, and was just as whiny as the factions themselves. So, when the game later gave me a choice to either save JC Denton or kill Billy Adams, I absolutely ended up killing her. Now, considering the ties Alex had with Billy, which goes all the way back to his childhood, you would expect Alex to be a bit regretful, a bit mournful of having to kill her. Instead, this happens.
Powerful for either. I'm going to destroy him while he's still weak. It's the only sane answer.
I can't let you do that. I'll kill you if I have to.
So this is how it ends? Okay, I'm ready, but I don't think you are. You may have dealt with SSC or even armored Templars before, but you've never taken on a true equal, or a friend. But I guess you're just as crazy as the rest of them. Another threat to be neutralized. It's over, Alex. Easy prey.
Yep, nothing. You just kill her and there is no mention of her there or from there on. This basically is an accurate representation of the character interaction you are going to have in this game. Very poor considering how the Deus Ex franchise as a whole have excellent character interactions. But here there is nothing like that. So, the story elements are poor, character interactions are poor. Well, how about the ending? You might expect the ending to be at least something that might ask questions or state statements to the player just like the first one. Well, not really. There are 4 endings to choose from here. Namely, the Omar ending, the Templar ending, the Apostle Corp ending, or the Illuminati ending, out of which I chose the Omar ending, or better known as the Renegade ending.
A remarkable achievement. You do not even comprehend today's significance for the future of this planet, but you have our gratitude. A discount will be applied to all of your business transactions with our agents anywhere in the world.
After the Great Collapse, only the mighty survived. 2 centuries of war saw the rise and fall of many empires. It was the age of heroes, the battle-fired crucible of all subsequent history. In the end, the Earth was no longer green. Nothing survived on its surface other than a few embers of humankind. But from this crucible emerged the masterworks of evolution. They were fit not just for the new Earth, but for the most barren corners of creation. The glory of humanity would henceforward stretch on, through time and space, to the vanishing point of eternity.
For context, the Omar are a network of cybernetic humans that deal in illegal markets and things of that like. The Omar are the only faction that really does not play much of a role in the main story, so I aligned with them because they were the only faction that was not hell-bent on ruining the world throughout the game. It is implied that the Omar also ruined the world, but again, I chose them because all the other factions were unlikable and it seemed like the Omar were the only chill guys that did their thing and were not constantly at each other's throats throughout the game. Speaking of the ending itself, it was very poor. It did not ask any questions, nor did I really feel like I saw anything new compared to the first game. The ending felt tacked on just because there had to be an ending there. Almost as if the game treated the situation like someone who would just give something to distract a child who has been constantly pestering them for like the past hour or so. All of that is not to say the game is all bad though. There are some really good quests in there, such as the series of quests that you have to do and race the other factions to rescue JC Denton. There are also some redeeming concepts to the game. For example, the concepts of these powerful factions being structured in a triangular shape is much more prominent here. A good example would obviously be that of the Illuminati. You get to see the 3 factions evolve out of the Illuminati throughout the story. The other concept that is cool to see working is NG Resonance. NG Resonance is a celebrity who has a hologram station throughout the social places where people could have personal moment with the celebrity. If you talk to NG Resonance, she seems to be like a genuine person, but throughout the story, you see that whatever you tell her would be collected as data and used in favor of the WTO. What's even bizarre is when you actually meet the real NG Resonance, she seems like she is not the NG Resonance we knew all along. Now, I know this is not that much of a new concept, but for 2003, I have to applaud it for the effort. At the end of the day though, the story overall suffers when you consider the fact that everything is just more serious compared to the first game. While the first game was also super tense and serious, it had its lighthearted moments with its dialogues.
You have a single fact to back that up?
Compared to that, here we have a long bunch of text with unasked exposition such as this.
Just another conspiracy theory. Does anyone have proof?
All I want is to understand what happened. The kidnapping, Saman leaving the church, a Templar army.
It's a hard time for the Church, but this is when Her Holiness needs your support. Tell her your concerns. She will put your mind at ease.
Perhaps you're right. May she forgive my doubt. I grew up in post-collapse Hong Kong. My parents were Max Chen and Maggie Chow, conspirators involved with MJ-12. My worst fear is that I'll give my allegiance to a deceptive cause. May order prevail.
Look, it's cool to see the daughter of some of the major characters from the first game and all, but this could have been done in a much better way. Now, before we conclude this review, I want to talk about the soundtracks. The soundtracks are made by Alexander Brandon, who also worked on the soundtracks for the first game. The soundtracks here are the better part of the game. Don't get me wrong, there's not much to write home here, but Alexander Brandon knows what he's doing. The soundtracks here have a desolate feeling that lines up with the overall narrative of desolation after the collapse in the first game. Now, there is a specific track that I do want to bring up, and that is the UNATCO theme flashback soundtrack that plays when you're in the apartment in JC's mind. This soundtrack really brings the desolation out after the crazy adventures that was the first game. Again, you're not gonna catch me vibing to these tracks, but in the context of the game, these are definitely what I would bring up as the good part of the game. In conclusion, Deus Ex Invisible War is a technically messed up and in some aspects bad game that does not hold a candle to the original game. The game did end up shelving the Deus Ex franchise for 7 years and leaving most of the Deus Ex fans disappointed. But the game does have traces of what could have been an interesting shift in tone for the whole Deus Ex franchise compared to what it is now. It does the job of revisiting the first game somewhat well, especially if you found the characters and location in the first game interesting and was curious to see them after the events of the first game. As far as recommendation is concerned, I would not recommend this game unless you are pretty much looking to play for Deus Ex games. But at the end of the day though, any Deus Ex is good Deus Ex, even if it's a broken mess.
Now